So the title of this, so here, for the common good indicates and implies a transition representing the current urgent task, the climate crisis. So I think the transition should be a civilizational transition that includes a transformation of the social system. Here again, I think the economy and community are two very important factors. I thought to myself about the interconnection among today's three presentation topics, but I'm not sure whether three presenters would present as I expected. So please, even now after your presentation, my expectations and questions have not changed. Therefore, in order to move forward, it is necessary to discuss what kinds of form and contents the term for the public interest has in it, for the common good, and in what way its values will work. So the next, we need to change the social system, especially the economic system. In that regard, what problems should be changed in the current capitalist economy, and how should they be introduced? So from Andrew's presentation, people just say that everything in capitalism is a problem, but isn't that too general? So now I'd like to ask three speakers to share their belief thoughts on this. If this is already been covered, provide a brief summary, and if not, tell us what you think. That's the first question. And the second question is, three of you is about the question about community. As Professor John Cobb always emphasizes, and many people talk about the local and community, but why community? And how to compete with the profit sectors if not completely replacing the existing mainstream profit economy, how can these areas survive and flourish? So as for the last question, I believe that the new economy should be sustainable, self-sufficient, circular, and resilient, especially based on locality and community. So I hope Andrew and Megan's presentation covers some of that. So please tell us what you think about combination of the two and the way the community and the economy are integrated. Specifically, there are job creation and income generation based on community business. And it may be about essential goods for life or products related to social values such as energy, food, care, and education. And it could be a local currency or time bank. So please give us your thoughts on that in turns. Anyone could start first.
It's a very easy task, thank you. Nothing too difficult to cover there. I'll just say a few words briefly because I want to get to the audience questions too as much as possible. But the thing that stands out to me, Gunna, in response to your questions is that if we change our understanding of what privatization means in terms of interdependence rather than independence, it already begins to shift the entire paradigm we're talking about to be a person is to be a person in community. And I think that changes everything about how we relate to one another, how we relate to the natural world, and should be a starting place for a new kind of economy, much like the kind that Megan has been discussing. But
yeah, I think I would build off what Andrew said. It's a new way of thinking. Like we live in a capitalistic system, and it's not going to change overnight. And so we have to begin making these changes about how do we want to do business. How do we want to deploy our essential resources? It's like energy. It's not going to go away. The need for energy is not going to go away, but how we deploy it can change the lives of our communities, and it can slowly change this society as well. So as when we're thinking, like, it can be privatized, or it can be owned, it can circulate wealth, and it can benefit individuals. I mean, it's a big shift, and it's hard, as we all know, but it's thinking, like Andrew said, it's not about just the individual, but it's how the impact webs out. Like, what are we hoping to accomplish and how can we make it so it's benefiting the most in society rather than the few?
I'd like to answer the question with the quoting John Cobb's. Yeah, it's a good strategy, right? Yeah. So, an economics for the common good is what ecological humanism calls for, and even more what stewardship for creation calls for. So the connection between the common good and ecological humanism highlights the idea of economic systems must not serve not only the well-being of people, but also the planet. So I think this is a very important aspect that we all need to remember in talking about the capitalism and the world economic system. And we need to think first about the well-being of the people, especially the people will be suffering, and also will have the marginalized, will be the marginalized people in the community, and those are the core community that we need to focus on in the economics. I'm not sure whether I answered your question. Yeah.
Okay, shall we pass the mic to the audience?
So the theory I get from John Cobb, and my questions from Megan, the practical, what's happening from you, is hope only at the local, like communal level, and the national level is a lost cause, or do you think there could still be national change? And if it's local, that's perhaps fine, and like your project is really great, but I'm really curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I definitely don't think hope is only at the national level, but I think to get to the national level, the sustainable way to move about it is to start local. And that's why in the slide about how we expand, it's expanding locally and it's expanding in the communities that need these resources and these jobs and this economic revitalization the most. But as that network expands, the change we create is together. So it's the power of each local community as the model expands across the country that generally will begin to change the national system. And so we talk a lot about localism, and I think the values and the change that we want to see in the world start at the local level. And as more and more and more people get on board, that's how you create societal and larger change. I hope that helps.
I wanted to pick up on Dr. Jung's pointer to the fact that critiques of capitalism might be a little bit overly simplistic. So if we imagine a world where everyone is enlightened or awakened or living from or as the inner Christ, it seems to me that any economic system, a form of capitalism, a form of communism, something in between, could work and lead to equivalent forms of total flourishing. So then, isn't the situation a little more complex than just saying, here's a problematic system, but rather it calls for an inquiry into the relationship between those processes of awakening or re-Christing at the individual level and the systemic pressures, whether any system, communist, capitalistic, or whatever, suppresses or represses that process. And then the question is, what are we to do in that much more complex scenario?
I would say I completely agree that the characterization of capitalism is often overly simplified. And I think what I was trying to do, at least in my simplification of it, was to point to something underneath it. So I think if capitalism is primarily about privatization, socialism primarily about public sharing commons and stuff, what happens when we blur the distinction between the two because we recognize an identity of interdependence? So I think that already begins to so the simplification in that sense is a way of saying, okay, we have to move past the paradigms that are beneath the expressions of capitalism or socialism or these sort of economic paradigms. But I think, I like what John Cobb and Herman Daly say, which is this. Our position is that centralized economic planning is insufficient, that allocations are better affected in the market than by bureaucratic planning. The role of government is to set fair conditions within which the market can operate. It's also it's responsible for setting the overall size or scale of the market. The market is not the end of social, and it is not the right instrument through which the ends of society should be set. We favor, Cobb and Daly, private ownership, which sounds like capitalism, of the means of production. We favor, though, the widest possible participation in that ownership, which now sounds like socialism, including worker-owned ownership of factories against its concentration in a few hands. So I actually think it's not either or, but something different altogether.
I was going to ask a question to Dr. Dongwoo Lee, but it seems like, Andrew, you just basically barged in and answered it.
You're welcome.
I'm still gonna bring up the topic because I think it's essential. Maybe we can deepen it a little bit more because it draws from your presentation and also Megan's presentation. I have this thing discovered through Whitehead that I try to exercise in the relationship with my wife, which is the many become one and are increased by one. And I think of our relationship actually as a third person. So I think that there are three people in our relationship, in our marriage. We don't have children yet, but still there's three. There's me, her, and us. And all of these three people they have needs, and they have to be given room. So I was wondering, and maybe you can choose who wants to answer the question, how we can get to the point that communities are actually being seen as let's say, you all are familiar with the problem of the commons, the tragic of the commons by Elinor Ostrom. So how can we nourish communal values, communal ownership, but at the same time not fall into communism, which would then maybe cause a lack of ambition, a lack of ownership, a lack of the feeling of belonging. So it basically builds on what you said, Andrew, so maybe one of the others would answer.
Well, for me, I've been thinking about that a lot as well when I've been studying in economics in my BA program. But I didn't have any answer yet. But I've been thinking that maybe in our system right now we are residing in, maybe the company like a co-op, corporation might be an answer for the systematic failure of the capitalism that we are experiencing right now. But so we are sharing and sharing the ownership, and or maybe we can say it's a public ownership, like a 공동 ownership, we can say. So I think that is the important the elements that we need to think about, not the privatization, but on the opposite side.
Do you want me to answer too? I do. Sorry. Yeah, I love what Dongwoo said, and I think, like you said, it's a balance. Didn't you have to balance privatization on one side, communism on the other end, and I do think co-ops are one way to get at that, because people then do feel motivated. I think they also feel part of a community, because the decisions in the business or the organization that you're in are now collective. And it starts to foster that mindset that everything we're doing is for not just me or not just you, but it's for this community and this organization. And then I think it allows us to begin to think more broadly, like there's the community and the organization. Also now, how does this impact the community beyond? And so I think circling that way of thinking, even on the smaller level, will help us expand to what this looks like at a society level.
Megan, my question's for you. Your presentation is really hopeful, but it also reminded me of the slogan, of the Texas energy independence movement of the last 100 years, which was power generated by Texans for Texans. And in the last 3 years, we've seen how disastrous that has been. So in CHIRP and the program, what kind of plans do y'all have or mechanisms do you have to keep from repeating that kind of disastrous localism?
Yeah, I don't know the Texas situation, I think, well enough to make sure I'm addressing what we're not repeating. Can you explain it a little bit more?
Well, so the basic idea was that when the national energy grids were being created, that Texas was not going to be included, that Texas was going to have its own energy grid that they were going to control and input, with the exception of the city of El Paso. In the last 3 years, major winter storms related to climate change have rendered that grid just useless, and then increasing heat in the summer has also rendered it useless. But because they're not connected with other parts of the national grid, there's no way for them to have good backups when the entire city of Austin goes down.
Yeah, I'll say that the way that we're integrating our energy systems, we're not saying like Edison be gone forever, because we know Edison will always still play a role until we find a great, we can revolutionize the entire system. But so for CHIRP, like when we're installing energy systems, they're still part of the larger grid. It's just that, and Edison will still control the distribution of energy, right? The energy that's created by community solar or any of these places is still distributed into an overall grid, but how people are paying for their energy is going not to this behemoth organization, but to a local nonprofit that will reinvest. I know we have talked a lot about like microgrids and getting like totally off the grid. But I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a lot of interest in like battery systems and backup. But then there's the problem of like, I don't know if there's enough lithium to support the amount of batteries that would require. So I think for a time being, the large utilities are still essential to maintaining just reliability, resiliency across the grid, but we have to start rethinking about how the role that they play in their even their resiliency to renewable energy. And I think there's been a lot of thoughts about like local energy co-ops, and there are some, like in Texas probably, where there is local energy production and control rather than larger utilities. And I think that might end up being more of the case as we go on into the future. And maybe there's a network then among all these local distributions, but the grid and the infrastructure in the grid is a massive problem, and it's also a massive problem in terms of like even supplying the amount of energy that we use in the United States, and we see that all the time. I don't think I did a great job of answering your question, but
I think it is a good job. Because I think it gets to this question of local versus regional or national or global, and I think it's not either or. It's communities of communities of communities, and that's a process view.
Actually, I handed it as the second one, but I waited long, so I'll be short. Okay, Dr. Lee, thank you for introducing Minjung theology for comparative eco-ethics. Actually, traditionally, the demarcation or classification of Gong and Sa, the private realm and the public realm, has been for centuries genderized as the public realm as women's prohibition, and the private realm is almost identified with women and the nature and all other oppressed groups. So that's one thing. Another thing is actually the fluidity of individual realm and also public realm in terms of encountering and guarding God. So you said like God is not privatized to anyone, but God is to be shared. Then clarifying your clear distinction of Kong, the public realm, as little bit like traditional kind of dualistic, genderized part that I am not really satisfied with that part. And what is the God that you said God is to be shared? Is the God power or Bob Rice or life that you said, then is kind of divine material force as God being, then why it's only for to be shared part, not in the private realm? God is very intimate in many sense. So.
Thank you. That is a very good question, and I honestly say that I never thought about in that way, but that is a very wonderful way to think about the concept of Minjung theology's terminology, Kong. Yes, it is related to the Confucianism idea of the public and private, but I believe Byung-Mu An's, the theologian Byung-Mu An's interpretation of Kong is not about the public sector and the private sector, this bifurcation, but it's more like the interpretation of the Genesis story. And he's trying to make a case for the economic sense. So I read him as in that way. And I totally agree that, in some sense, the concept of God, there's a lot of story, but I'm going to make it very short. You asked about what part of God is shared among people, and I think the Byung-Mu An meant to be think that the elements that being shared by God is love and peace. So that's my reading.
Let's give the panel a hand, friends. Thank you very much. Excellent.